Good evening, Summoners. My name is John, and this is episode 3, count them 3, 1, 2, 3, of League Learning, one I'm calling Modern Metagame. And I know a lot of people may have started playing bot games or games in general, and had people call for certain lanes or say, no, you can't go there because you're not a certain lane or whatever. And I wanted to clear up some of the confusion about the metagame, aka where people go and why. So, the first thing I want to introduce to you is a concept that I like to call the utility curve, which is simply the way a champion will scale over time. Now, in general, we'll go back over the classes that we went over last time from episode 2, namely tanks, carries, casters, bruisers, and supports, and how they scale with the game, because the utility curve is actually important to understanding why people go where they go. So, simply put, let's start off with tanks. Tanks, for their utility, they don't do a whole lot of damage. Normally I would call it a damage over time curve, but instead, tanks don't really do a whole lot of damage, but they have a lot of usefulness, aka utility. So I'm replacing the term damage with utility, and understand that the utility curve is how a champion will perform over time. The higher on the utility curve, the better. And the way the utility curve behaves, whether it's steep or whether it's shallow, determines how well they scale. And you can get an idea. Anybody who knows anything about mathematics and graphs knows that the higher the slope, the better it is in terms of getting to the late game. If the late game is over here and the early game is here, you want to get from here up to here. So, that being said, tanks in the early game have very little utility. They're kind of down here. They don't have very much utility because they don't have very much health. And they don't really have use of all of their abilities because, well, tanks rely a lot on their abilities to disable people and to absorb damage. So they end up down here. However, as the game continues, they buy more items, and they gradually gain more health as they level up. So they have sort of a flat level curve, or they have a flat utility curve. Not a flat, sorry, a more or less linear utility curve with a slight curve upwards, as in they get more useful as the game goes on, more useful than if you just sort of drew a line. So they have a slight exponential increase to their utility curve, but on the whole, they start low, and they end about medium. Okay. Now, on the other hand, carries start the game very low, because they rely very much on items to do their damage. So, because in the early game you don't have a whole lot of gold to buy your items, you start off very low. However, by the late game, when a fully built AD carry has all of their items and is doing 700 plus damage a shot with their critical hits, you have a very steep curve. And it starts off very low for a while because the gold you get in the early game doesn't really do a whole lot for you. But as you accumulate more and more, it gets you more kills, you start killing minions more easily, and it starts to sort of snowball until you get to the point where you've got a very steep curve leading up to the late game. And the late game has very, very high potential / utility for a carry, but they start off the game very low. So they don't have a very good early game, and they get sort of carried in the early game, but then by the late game they're carrying the rest of the team, thus the name carry. Now let's talk about casters. Casters are very much like tanks. They are sort of they're very linear. Caster scales in the early game primarily by level, because from levels 1 through 3, you're gaining a new ability, and thus more damage, every time you level up. Now once you hit level 6 and you have all 4 of your abilities, you have your maximum damage potential in terms of what your abilities can do. However, the more you level up, the more initial damage those skills will do. And as you go along with scaling runes on AP or with masteries, your AP will increase, and so your damage will increase as well. And so as buying items and leveling goes, they start to level up a little bit steeper than a tank will. So a caster starts off pretty strong. By level 3 they have all 3 of their main damage skills, or sometimes a defense skill, and then they will go all the way up to medium high in terms of utility. Now let's talk about bruisers. Bruisers, very much like tanks, because they're very tanky, start off the game, kind of about low. They can't really do a whole lot of damage. And like a carry, they rely very much on their items to be able to do damage and take damage. So they also have kind of a steep curve, but they end even above casters in terms of total utility. Now, finally, we've got to talk about supports. And a support starts off the game fairly high in utility, being able to being able to heal the AD carry, being able to provide crowd control to the team. These are very crucial functions early in the game, and the damage that a support does early game is typically pretty high in comparison. So they start off medium-high. However, they have an extremely flat utility curve because they don't really buy items that do a lot of damage or provide a whole lot of utility, and are there to just sort of up their team's damage and usefulness in battle overall. And they do it just by a little bit, but they help everybody on their team rather than directly contributing to the damage. Now this is crucial understanding why people go in their certain places, and typically what we got to talk about next, we have to talk about the 3 phases of the game. You have the first phase, the laning phase. This is where everyone goes to their lanes and they just try to farm up creeps. They may try to kill each other. The jungler may come in and try to gank people. Things are fairly stable during the laning phase, but the laning phase can dictate who ends up winning the game in the long term. Next, you have the middle, where after the laning phase is starting to end, you have ganking going around. You have different lanes ganking other lanes. You have teams starting to gather for objective gathering, like gathering to kill a tower or to kill a dragon, things like that. And then finally, in the late game, you have the team fight phase, the team fight and pushing for the nexus, where the team tends to gather in 5s and they fight each other out, and then whoever wins ends up pushing the objectives of the other team, and then they sort of reset once the other team spawns and they do it again. So with the understanding of the 3 phases, we're going to talk about the laning phase because that's primarily what the metagame refers to, where people go. So the first thing we want to talk about is the middle lane. Typically it's called solo mid, and this is where Team Solo Mid, the top champion in North America, gets their name, because solo mid is the primary way. Now the solo lane is important because it gives a lot of experience and a lot of gold. Now you have gold being important for buying items, so anybody who scales well on items is going to need gold, aka everyone but supports. And the experience is important for people who scale with levels, for example, bruisers and casters, and tanks to an extent. So it's important that bruisers, casters, and tanks get solo lanes because they scale primarily with level, or they scale very highly with level. So the middle lane is a caster, and I'll explain why a caster as opposed to a bruiser or tank later. Next, we have the bot. The bottom lane is a duo lane, and you have a carry together with a support. And the reason you have a carry and a support together rather than a caster and a support or a bruiser and a support is because the carry is very weak early game. Remember, we talked about the utility curve. The carry starts here and ends here, and the support starts up here and sort of ends not very far above there either. So long story short, you have a support to sort of offset the bad early game of a carry. And also, the support kind of ends up getting shafted on the gold because it gives a good support will give all of the creep steal, the CS, to the AD carry. And now why is that? The reason an AD carry can get away with being a duo lane is because they scale almost entirely with items and not with level. A late game AD carry, it doesn't matter what level they are as long as they have their items and are doing absurd amounts of damage with auto attacks. Because they don't rely on their abilities and thus their levels to do damage, it's more important that an AD carry gets their items than it is for them to get their levels. And in turn, the support is not really a factor in the late game, and so we don't really even consider sort of the late game implications. The support is there to help the AD carry reach the late game. Without the support, an AD carry will typically not accelerate into the late game like one that does have a good support. So you have the AD carry gets the gold for his items, but doesn't really need the experience. And the support doesn't really need the gold or the experience as much, so you put them together in a lane.